Okay, here we go. Let's see about taking this apart. I've already removed the screws from the side. So then carefully, because there are buttons around it, remove the lid. And we can see inside. This is the IC we're going to be replacing. There's only one of them on the board, so it's easy enough to find. It's down in this little corner. You'll find it has lots of wires over it. There's a bit of tape there which hold the wires in place. The main trick for removing this is the danger of damaging any of these wires. There are loads of wires and they all go all around the top of it. So to remove this IC, instead of using direct heat from either the soldering iron or the hot air soldering iron, we're going to actually cut the IC off the board. Just because trying to put a lot of heat, which would be required to remove that, would be quite dangerous to the really fine wires around it. So move the wire slightly out of the way, starting at one end of the chip. You just cut the legs at the shoulder joints. Be very careful when doing it not to dig into the board or to accidentally snip any of the wires. But you should be able to if you have a fine pair of cutters. I'm using very pointy cutters. Just nip the shoulder joints of the IC's legs. There we go. Just going to examine, make sure I've done them all. Of course, if you do damage any of the wires, they are only wires, so you can just replace them by tracking them round. There we go. You'll find when you've cut all the legs that it'll just lift away. So because it's quite tight to get your cutters in there, like this one for instance, there is one side is lifted fully, there we go, it's just finding the leg that's still made. So then take your tweezers and be very gentle when doing it because some of the legs will not have broken fully. There we go. One IC removed. So now it's just a case of putting the new one back on. So first thing we need to do is clean the pads. The pads, after you've clipped the legs off, will have a little bit of leg left on the pad. So to do so, you need to make sure you're holding all of the wire out of the way. And then take a very fine soldering iron. I use a very pointy one here, being very careful not to damage any of the wires. Just heat the pad and you brush the little remain of the leg off the pad. Be mindful of which way round you're holding it so that you're not crossing your soldering iron really close to any of the wires. Of course, if you're not confident cutting it off like I've done, you could attempt to unsolder some of the wires, making careful notes of exactly where they're connected, and then resolder them when you've removed it. But I think this is an easier method if you're able to cut the legs off. The trickiest one for this is in this back corner here, because there are two wires. The wire splays around that corner and really makes it quite difficult to get in there, but it is doable. You just have to make sure you've got the wires held down while you remove stuff. Okay, that's all the remains of the legs removed. I'm now just checking to make sure that the area is smooth enough for me to stick the new IC on, or whether I need to solder wick away some of the solder to make it really flat. But it looks smooth enough there, so I'm going to position the IC and then just solder it into place. It's going to be tricky getting it in there with all the wires in the way. There we go. When soldering any surface mount part like this, best to pick one corner, heat it and solder it, just so it joins enough that the IC isn't moving, and then double check that your IC is positioned correctly everywhere else, then solder the opposite corner to hold it in place. There we are. So the IC is not moving, it's perfectly positioned. So now I'm going to manoeuvre some of the wire out of the way and then actually solder it with some new solder. Because I'm needing two hands for this bit, I'm going to take a bit of masking tape and just use that to hold the wire out of the way. There we go. The thinner solder the better. I'm using really thin solder. That side done. When peeling your tape that you've used to hold the wire down, be very careful. I'm holding the wire while I'm peeling it because you don't want to unduly pull the wires. Secure them at that end. Yeah. Trickiest part of this is the three wires at the far end down here, because they are the most tightly packed underneath wire. So I'm going to peel that back off and manoeuvre the wire in a different way so I can open up the very top of it. And then go in from a different angle for these last three. There we go. Just going to slightly neaten up that last joint. Not necessary for it working, but I like to make things look reasonably neat. And there we have it. New IC soldered in place. Now you'll find at the edges of the board there are gaps for the wires to go in, and it's important you make sure all your wires are fed through those gaps correctly when you try and put the case back together, because if not, the case will pinch the wires and it either won't go on correctly or it may well break one of the wires. So position that as best you can there, and then reapply the bit of tape that it had on originally. there. When sticking the case back on, make sure you put this end on first because it has some buttons that have to come through the case first, so you have to put that end down first and then position the other end. There we go. If there are no wires or anything in the way, it will nicely sit back into position. Okay, I'm just going to stick the screws back in here, and then it will be the moment of truth. When taking the screws out earlier, I noted that one of the screws, there are 4 to remove, one of them is shorter than the others, so it's worth noting where that came from. Okay. The shorter screw came from next to the power import. Not sure how relevant that is. It might be that it has a different thread underneath it, less space, or it might be it's a random shorter screw we have. Okay, here we go. Let's find the eject button. You can tell this isn't mine because I assume there's an eject button. Maybe it's just a lift. Defeated. There we go, it lifts that way. We have our power pack. Make sure it's in the right way round. Stick this in. Close it down and do a quick listen check. There is no whirring, which I believe means it's fixed. It's what we like to hear.